In most wars, death comes from what you can see: bullets, bombs, rockets screaming through the air. But in Vietnam, death came from the earth. It came from the ground under your boots, from the trail you'd walked 100 times before, from the one patch of mud that looked no different than the others, from the bamboo root that wasn't quite in the right place. And when it came, it didn't announce itself with a gunshot. It came with a click, or with silence. And then came the screaming. In 1966, a 19-year-old Army private named Carson Lee was walking point through a trail in the Iron Triangle, a region so infamous for booby traps that some units called it the Devil's Orchard. His foot landed on something solid but not quite natural. Just as his weight shifted, he heard the faintest metallic click. He froze. His squad froze. They all knew what that sound meant. It wasn't gunfire. It wasn't a mine explosion. It was worse. It was the sound of a trap being armed, a death sentence already halfway written. Carson didn't move. For 4 hours, he stood there sweating, trembling, barely breathing until the engineers arrived. They disarmed the trap inch by inch, only to discover a grenade rigged under a piece of plywood, held in place by a tripwire almost invisible in the jungle light. That was Vietnam. Every step was a gamble. Every inch of dirt could kill you. Booby traps in Vietnam weren't accidents of terrain, they were weapons. Engineered, planned, and brutally effective. They weren't meant to win battles. They were meant to bleed men, slow them down, shake their morale, make them question every decision. And it worked. In fact, by some estimates, over 11% of all U.S. combat deaths in Vietnam were caused by booby traps and landmines. And for injuries, the number was even higher, up to 20% in certain regions, like Quang Tri, Tay Ninh, or the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But the scariest part? The booby trap didn't care how good of a soldier you were. It didn't care if you were a hero or a rookie. It didn't care about your rank, your training, your gear. It was a war fought not just above the ground, but beneath it. Vietnam's terrain was the perfect killing field for booby traps. The thick underbrush, the tangled vines, the endless supply of mud, roots, fallen leaves. Every square foot was a potential hiding place, and the Viet Cong knew it. They turned the jungle into a living trap. They studied how American soldiers moved. They mapped out likely trails. And then they seeded those trails with hidden death. Buried grenades, sharpened bamboo spikes, pressure-triggered mortar shells, tripwires tied to tree branches, snake pits with live cobras. These weren't just traps. They were psychological warfare. Every squad had stories. Every unit had scars. Every soldier had that one moment they stepped wrong and lived to remember it. The terrifying genius of the Viet Cong's trap system was that it didn't require a firefight. There was no enemy to shoot back at, no sound of incoming, just a flash, a scream, a body down in the mud. By the time the dust cleared, the enemy was long gone or had never even been there to begin with. One Marine recalled, "You didn't even get mad at the enemy. You got mad at the trail, at the ground, at the dirt." And that was the point. The Viet Cong didn't have to win every battle. They just had to make the Americans afraid to walk. Today, when people think of Vietnam, they think of Huey helicopters, jungle firefights, napalm drops. But the truth, the quiet, horrifying truth is that many American soldiers didn't die in battle. They died walking to it. In this documentary, we'll uncover the terrifying world of Vietnam's booby traps, how they were designed, how they were hidden, how they worked, and how American troops learned to survive them, or didn't. We'll hear from engineers, medics, tunnel rats, and survivors. We'll explore the mechanical brilliance and brutal simplicity behind these deadly devices. And we'll walk the same trails, step by step, where one wrong foot could mean the end. Because in Vietnam, war didn't always wait for you to find the enemy. Sometimes, the enemy was already under your feet. How the Viet Cong engineered the jungle into a killing field. The traps were never random. To the untrained eye, It looked like chaos: bamboo spikes, tripwires, hidden grenades, bouncing mines scattered across dense trails. But to the Viet Cong, it was a system, a method, a silent doctrine of warfare written not with bullets, but with pressure plates, fishhooks, and gravity. Every device had a purpose. Every placement had a reason. They didn't just want to kill. They wanted to slow you, bleed you, paralyze your squad, and most of all, make you fear the ground beneath your boots. Many American soldiers believed they were walking into battles with guerrillas hiding in the trees. What they didn't realize was that the jungle itself had already been turned into a weapon long before they arrived. Take a simple trail near the Cambodian border. To an American patrol, it looked well-trodden, even safe. But in reality, it had been seeded the night before with a daisy chain of old 105mm artillery shells, buried 6 inches under the dirt, all connected by salvaged wire to a spring-loaded trigger made from a bike spoke and a bent nail. It wasn't just lethal, it was brilliant. It cost the VC nothing, but it could vaporize an entire squad. The genius lay in improvisation. Vietnam was a poor man's war, especially for the guerrilla. The Viet Cong didn't have tanks or aircraft or advanced munitions, but they had time, terrain, and a deep understanding of how American troops moved. They observed patrol patterns. They studied the rhythm of each unit, when they rested, where they stepped. They didn't need to win firefights. They needed to make the enemy doubt every path forward. One of the most devastating weapons wasn't a mine at all. It was a simple wire stretched across a narrow trail, knee-height, almost invisible. When triggered, it released a bundle of sharpened bamboo spikes from a tree branch, falling like a pendulum, slashing through the air at head level. One moment you were walking, the next your jugular was gone. Some traps were placed near natural choke points, narrow footbridges, creeks, fallen logs. Others were hidden in areas designed to look too obvious, tricking squads into believing they were decoys, only to find the real trap behind them. Others used bait. An abandoned rifle placed carefully on the jungle floor, a downed rucksack, a pair of boots. The moment a curious soldier reached down, a tripwire would trigger a fragmentation grenade or a downward-facing spike trap. The instinct to recover gear became a death sentence. Even the materials were clever. The Viet Cong often used American munitions, unexploded mortar rounds, dud grenades, shell casings left behind after firefights. They rearmed them, rewired them, buried them beneath fake roots, or covered them with leaves soaked in mud. One Marine in Quang Tri described it like this: "You were walking through a forest made of explosives. Except the forest didn't look any different. You just hoped you were too light, too lucky, or too slow to trigger one." Some traps didn't even need to explode to be effective. Punji pits, deep holes filled with sharpened bamboo stakes, often coated in feces, were designed not to kill, but to cripple. A wounded soldier cried out. His teammates were forced to stop, apply first aid, call a medevac, and hold position. The whole unit was now stalled, vulnerable, mission abandoned. Trap successful. Worse, many traps were paired in sequence. A first trap would wound a man. When the squad rushed to help, a second device triggered by movement or pressure would detonate, causing multiple casualties. It was engineered cruelty, psychological warfare disguised as crude jungle mechanics. American combat engineers who disarmed these traps described the experience as disarming a conversation, a back and forth between logic and deception. Every wire, every notch, every angle told a story. And the Viet Cong were fluent storytellers. Sometimes the traps were silent for weeks. A trail could go untouched, untriggered, used safely by American patrols. And then one morning, something changed. A squad moved through as usual, and one man vanished in a cloud of earth, blood, and bamboo. That was the brilliance of it. The enemy wasn't there, but the fear was. The moment you doubted the ground, your weapon, your step, you lost initiative. The Viet Cong didn't need to overwhelm U.S. forces with firepower. They overwhelmed them with impossibility, with a battlefield where any step could be the last. A war where the deadliest soldier wasn't a sniper or a sapper. It was a carpenter with a shovel, a hacksaw, and a homemade fuse. That was the real enemy in Vietnam. A man who didn't need to shoot you to win. He just needed to make the ground do it for him. Punji traps and spike pits. Crippling fear. below the surface. It was always the sound that came first. Not an explosion, not a gunshot, just the sharp, wet scream of a man falling, followed by silence. And then the smell: blood, mud, and something fouler still, human waste, soaked into bamboo, waiting to infect whatever it couldn't kill outright. The punji pit was Vietnam's most primitive weapon. It was also one of its most effective. A shallow hole, a few sharpened stakes, covered with leaves or palm thatch, designed to collapse the moment a boot pressed too hard. Simple, brutal, inevitable. American soldiers first encountered them in the early months of jungle patrols. At first, they seemed like bad luck, a clumsy accident, a hole someone had dug in the wrong place. But then came the patterns: men impaled through the calf, the thigh, the groin. Never killed instantly. Always screaming. Always down. Some of the pits were lined with stakes angled upward, forcing the leg deeper if the man tried to pull himself out. Others were rigged with lateral barbs, designed to slice tendons as the body fell. And then there were the truly horrific ones, where every stake had been carefully dipped in feces, rotting food, or animal blood. The infection began before the bleeding stopped. These were not just traps. They were messages. Messages that said, "We don't have to kill you. We just have to hurt you badly enough that your squad won't leave you behind." And that's exactly what happened. Every punji pit triggered a cascade of consequences. The patrol stopped. Security was compromised. A medevac had to be called in, sometimes under fire. Medics rushed forward. Others covered them. Every second lost to bleeding or indecision increased the risk of ambush. Sometimes the pit was a lure. Sometimes it was the first move in a layered trap. And sometimes it was just there to break morale. One soldier described it like this: "It didn't just wound the guy who fell. It wounded the whole damn squad." The locations were calculated: on narrow trails, near stream crossings, under fallen logs, anywhere a footstep was guaranteed. In tall grass, the traps vanished completely. Metal detectors couldn't find bamboo. The only defense was paranoia. There were nights when patrols moved only 10 feet every hour, testing each patch of soil with a bayonet or a stick, praying they weren't too late. Every leaf looked suspicious. Every shadow was a whisper. Eventually, even standing still felt dangerous. But punji traps weren't limited to pits. The Viet Cong experimented with vertical configurations too. Stakes tied to swinging logs, tripped by hidden wires. Bamboo springboards packed with spikes, snapping into the chest or neck. There were door traps in underground tunnels, booby-trapped panels rigged to release spikes into the belly of anyone who opened them. In some cases, even captured U.S. helmets were used as bait, placed just far enough ahead that a curious soldier might step off trail. And sometimes they got creative. There were venom pits, where the bamboo was rubbed with snake venom or crushed centipedes. Some included rusted metal scrap, nails, or even razor blades scavenged from downed American gear. The goal wasn't sophistication. It was saturation. 1,000 simple traps, each costing pennies to build, but each capable of halting a modern, million-dollar military machine. For the Viet Cong, bamboo was more than a plant. It was a weapon system. It was quiet, cheap, replenishable. It didn't jam. It didn't run out of ammo. And best of all, it made the Americans fear the ground itself. Fear is what the punji pit really delivered. Not just pain, but hesitation. A crawling unease that settled into every mission brief, every pre-patrol check, every whispered conversation at dawn. The idea that death didn't need to shout, that it could wait in silence under the leaves. Many soldiers carried the scars for life, not just physical ones, but the memory of what it sounded like when the pit opened beneath a friend. The splash, the scream, the frantic attempts to lift a man who was already torn through. In the end, it didn't take technology to break a superpower, just a hole in the ground, a few sharpened sticks, and the unshakable certainty that somewhere ahead, someone was going to step in. In Vietnam, the jungle didn't just hide the enemy. The jungle was the enemy. Traps meant to maim, not kill. There was a moment every soldier in Vietnam learned to fear: not the explosion itself, but the split second before it. A sudden tug on the ankle, a whisper of tension along the shin, a branch snapping in the wrong direction. And then the realization, faster than panic, I just tripped something. Sometimes there was no blast. Sometimes it wasn't meant to kill right away. Sometimes the trap was designed to do something far more cruel: tear flesh, blind eyes, shred muscle, and leave a man screaming in the dirt while his squad froze, exposed, unable to move forward or back. The Viet Cong understood a brutal truth of jungle warfare. Killing one soldier removed one body from the field. Wounding one soldier removed three: the injured man, the buddy helping him, and the medic trying to save him. A single casualty could grind an entire patrol to a halt. And so, many traps were engineered not to end a life, but to destroy a limb, ruin a face, or crush a hand. Pain was a weapon. Screaming was a tactic. Blood was a signal flare. One of the simplest devices was a tripwire tied to a grenade, except the grenade wasn't buried. It was hung from a tree, just above chest height. The moment a soldier brushed against the wire, the spoon snapped free, and 3 seconds later, shrapnel tore sideways through the jungle, ripping into faces, throats, and eyes. A man might live, but he'd never see again. His squad would be pinned, terrified to move, and the Viet Cong, already gone, didn't need to fire a single shot. Then there were the whip traps. A length of bamboo bent under tension, held in place by a crude latch. The wire ran low across the trail. When tripped, the bamboo snapped forward with the speed of a striking animal, driving rusty spikes or sharpened metal scraps into a man's calves or groin. The wounds weren't clean. They festered fast. Infection often did what the trap didn't. Some devices were designed to burn rather than pierce. American units in the highlands stumbled onto jars filled with gasoline or homemade chemicals, rigged to fall and ignite when a path was disturbed. A man caught in one of these would stumble backward, clothes ablaze, choking on fumes. His squad would rush to help, and that rush was exactly what the trap intended, because 10 feet behind the burn zone, buried just beneath the soil, sat a pressure-triggered mine. When the rescuers stepped in, the real explosion came. Engineers called these secondary traps. Soldiers had another word for them: the finishers. There were swinging doors hidden in tunnels, thin wooden panels that flipped open to reveal blades or spikes driven by gravity. Anyone crawling ahead, flashlight shaking, would trigger the mechanism and take steel directly to the chest or face. Tunnel rats, those unlucky men who went underground, learned to inch forward with one hand extended, praying they touched wood before wood touched them. The nastiest of all might have been the fragmentation traps built from discarded American ordnance. A mortar round lodged into a bamboo tube, wired to a peg in the ground. Step on the peg and the round didn't explode upward. It detonated sideways, at knee level, shredding legs, severing arteries, and filling flesh with metal fragments that medics often couldn't remove. Survivors didn't walk again. Some never stood again. And sometimes the traps played with instinct. A fallen comrade lying ahead motionless, apparently dead. In reality, he was a mannequin, stuffed uniform and all. The moment someone rushed forward, a hidden pressure plate triggered a burst of sharpened stakes from the ground. Rushing to save a life became a death sentence. The trap wasn't built to kill the first man. It was waiting for the second. What made these devices terrifying wasn't just the damage they caused, it was the uncertainty. A soldier could be fine 1 second and destroyed the next, without ever seeing the enemy. The forest didn't warn. The trail didn't change color. The danger was woven into the environment like a cruel thread. As days turned into weeks, squads slowed to a crawl. Men dragged sticks in front of them. Some crawled on hands and knees. Others refused to move at all unless they had engineers. Every mission felt like walking through a nightmare that punished movement itself. A jungle designed to snap bones, burn flesh, and bleed confidence dry. By the time many soldiers realized the truth, it was too late. The traps didn't have to kill to win. They just had to stop you, break you, make you afraid to take the next step. And in Vietnam, being afraid of the next step was enough to lose the war 1 footfall at a time. How the Viet Cong crippled American armor without firing a shot. The M113 rumbled forward, its tracks clattering across the dirt road outside Tay Ninh. Inside, 12 infantrymen sat in silence, some gripping their rifles, others just staring at the floor, counting minutes. They'd been on this route before. It was supposed to be safe, a cleared corridor, as the map said. But 50 feet ahead, the front left track dipped ever so slightly, just enough to press down a buried disc, no wider than a dinner plate, connected to a chain of artillery shells salvaged from an old French depot. The blast came up from underneath, not from a rocket, not from enemy fire, but from the very road itself. In an instant, the M113's floor buckled, its side armor ripped open like a can. Flames punched upward through the troop compartment. The vehicle lifted, then dropped. Its right side caved in. Men screamed. One was thrown clear. The rest never got out. That was the paradox of Vietnam. The United States brought tanks to fight a guerrilla war, and the guerrillas figured out how to stop them with shovels, scrap metal, and stolen munitions. The Viet Cong didn't have armored divisions, no T-55 seconds, no anti-tank missiles, but they had patience, they had the terrain, and they had an endless supply of ingenuity. Mines and booby traps became the great equalizer, especially against armored vehicles. To stop a tank, they didn't need to pierce the turret. They just needed to break the track, shred the underbelly, or flip the vehicle with a buried charge. Suddenly, the armor that once promised safety became a steel coffin. Many of the devices were made from leftover U.S. weapons. 155mm artillery shells were favorites dug from old battlefields, diffused, rewired, and buried. Others used aerial bombs that had failed to detonate. With the right pressure plate, often made from wood or a squashed ration, those bombs became impromptu tank killers. American APCs, especially the lightly armored M113, were frequent victims. The vehicle's aluminum hull couldn't withstand an IED made from a repurposed artillery shell. A mine buried just beneath the centerline would send molten fragments through the floor, slicing through passengers before they even knew what hit them. And the Viet Cong didn't just bury mines randomly. They studied traffic patterns. They watched how convoys moved. They knew where engineers swept and where they didn't. And they waited sometimes for days before laying a single trap at just the right bend, just the right hill crest, just the right ford. In some cases, they created false safe zones. They'd detonate one mine to get American engineers to sweep the area, then lay a second device just outside the cleared perimeter after the unit moved on. When the follow-up patrol came through, confident the path was clean, the trap would spring. Tank crews learned quickly that their vehicles were not invincible. Even the mighty M48 Patton, with its thick armor and 90mm gun, was vulnerable. A mine might not destroy it outright, but it could blow off a track, immobilize the vehicle, and force the crew to bail under fire. Once stuck, the tank became a target for RPGs, ambushes, or secondary traps. Some traps were psychological. A dummy mine placed visibly in the road would stall a convoy. Troops dismounted. Engineers went to work. Then, while everyone focused on the obvious threat, the real mine detonated, hidden in the tree line, triggered by a tripwire or a delayed fuse. In certain areas, the enemy even used water as a weapon. Under shallow streams, they buried explosives in waterproof casings, knowing U.S. vehicles would drive through without hesitation. The water masked the signs of disturbed earth. The current erased any tracks, and when the pressure plate was triggered, the explosion was magnified by the water's force, sending shockwaves straight into the vehicle hull. There was no standard pattern, no clear countermeasure. Some units started driving with sandbags on the floor. Others mounted mine rollers, makeshift steel frames meant to absorb the blast before it reached the vehicle. But even that wasn't foolproof. One engineer, after losing a colleague to a mine under an M551 Sheridan, said, "It didn't matter what you were riding. If they wanted to stop you, they didn't aim for your armor. They aimed for your momentum." The Viet Cong couldn't win a tank battle, so they made sure there were no tank battles. Just roadways that ended in smoke, convoys that never arrived, crews who didn't dare push forward another mile. Because in Vietnam, the enemy didn't meet your tank head-on. He waited under it. How fear became a weapon in Vietnam's trap war. Some traps weren't meant to explode. They didn't snap or burn or bleed. They whispered, They waited. They made soldiers hesitate, made them look twice at every shadow, every branch, every breeze that moved the jungle leaves. It was fear itself that did the killing. The Viet Cong understood this better than most modern armies. They didn't just build traps with spikes or shells. They built traps out of silence, suspicion, and psychology. There were stories of snake pits, live vipers caged in bamboo baskets, suspended by vines, rigged to fall the moment a soldier triggered a wire. Step wrong on a jungle path, and a deadly snake dropped into your shirt collar. The bite wasn't instant death, but it sent venom through the bloodstream fast. Some soldiers collapsed within minutes. Others survived barely but carried the trauma for years. More terrifying was the unpredictability. A tripwire might release a sack filled with scorpions or centipedes. In other cases, a simple spring-loaded mechanism would lash a bundle of stinging plants across a man's face. There were even accounts of concealed pits containing animal carcasses left to rot when triggered. They sent up a burst of disease-filled gas so foul that troops vomited where they stood. It wasn't about injury. It was about breaking nerves. One Marine described entering a village near Quang Ngai. No gunfire, no enemy in sight, but the place felt wrong. Dolls were nailed to doors. Children's shoes hung from trees. Every doorway was closed. No sound. The squad moved in carefully, only to discover the paths between the huts had been lined with human feces and fishing hooks stuck upright in the mud. A man who stepped off the trail had his boot torn open, his foot shredded, and his morale shattered. These weren't elaborate traps. They weren't lethal, but they were calculated. And they worked. Fear slowed patrols more effectively than bullets ever could. Troops began to mistrust everything. The trail ahead, the rock by the tree, the vine hanging too low. Some soldiers refused to move until an engineer swept the area first. Others developed superstitions: always step with the left foot first, never walk in the same place twice, never trust a path that looked too clear. A rustling in the bushes might cause an entire squad to hit the dirt. Seconds turned to minutes. Minutes became hours. And in jungle warfare, time was vulnerability. The most unsettling traps were the ones that felt personal. A helmet placed on the ground in plain view. A dog tag nailed to a tree. A letter from home, soaked and torn, hanging from a branch. Bait, but not just to lure soldiers into the open. Bait to unsettle them, to remind them, we see you. We know who you are. We know what you miss. In some cases, Viet Cong units left false trails of blood leading into booby-trapped bunkers. American troops followed the signs, thinking they might find a wounded comrade or a captured prisoner. Instead, they walked into a pressure plate or a deadfall. And when the dust settled, the trail behind them was gone, intentionally covered, as if the jungle itself had swallowed them whole. Psychological warfare didn't need to be loud. It didn't even need to be violent. It just had to linger. Veterans of these patrols often remembered the smells more than the sounds: rot, mold, sweat, the copper sting of blood mixed with jungle mud. Others remembered the silence, broken only by radio static and the rustling of leaves that might or might not hide a wire. Many never saw the enemy once during their entire tour, but they saw the traps. They felt the fear, and that was enough. Because in Vietnam, surviving a day didn't mean escaping the war. It meant walking out of the jungle and knowing you'd have to walk back in tomorrow. And tomorrow, the traps would still be there, not always buried in the ground. Sometimes, they were already in your mind. How U.S. troops adapted to survive the jungle of traps. By late 1967, the myth of American invincibility had been shattered, not by a grand battle, not by superior numbers, but by things that could barely be seen: a bent twig, a taut wire, a pressure plate the size of a cigarette pack. The jungle was winning, slowly, quietly, step by step. And so, the Americans began to change. New recruits fresh off the transport were handed rifles, ammo, and something even more important: fear. Veterans didn't sugarcoat it. Step where I step. Touch nothing. If it looks safe, it's probably not. That was the rule. Point men, those who walked first, carried more than just weapons. They carried the burden of survival for the whole squad. They moved slow, eyes scanning every branch, every bump in the soil. Some used sticks to probe the earth ahead. Others held bayonets like divining rods, sweeping the underbrush inch by inch. One wrong step meant 10 men never made it home. Some units started attaching tripwire feelers to their boots, thin strips of metal or antenna wire that dragged just ahead, designed to catch any low-lying snare. Others tied pieces of white cloth to their gear, marking every safe step behind them so the next man knew exactly where to follow. Patrol formations changed. No more walking shoulder to shoulder through jungle trails. Now they moved single file, with wide gaps in between. That way, if a mine went off, only one man might go down. Engineers developed crude but effective trap-clearing tools. Some squads carried lightweight poles with mirrors attached to the end, scanning beneath low-hanging branches or under door frames in captured villages. Others used mirrors strapped to sticks to peek around corners. In the tunnels, rats used flashlights taped to their pistols and crawled inch by inch, sweeping for wires before their elbows triggered a fatal mistake. Some infantrymen learned to read the jungle, a vine that hung unnaturally, a log that looked freshly placed, leaves that weren't settled quite right, a path that seemed too open. The jungle had patterns. Disturbances meant human hands had been there, and that meant something was waiting. The trick was not to see the trap. It was to feel that it didn't belong. Commanders changed their tactics. Instead of predictable daytime patrols, units began moving at night, relying on stealth rather than speed. But even darkness brought no safety. Some VC traps were designed to be triggered by infrared or sound. It became a contest of nerves and patience. Who would blink first, the man or the jungle? In some fire bases, entire days were spent training soldiers to spot traps before they even left the wire. Live demonstrations were held, dummies blown apart by simulated mines, spike traps triggered in front of the platoon. Fear, they learned, wasn't a weakness. It was survival instinct, sharpened by repetition. Even gear evolved. Some men lined their boots with extra rubber to reduce pressure. Others strapped sandbags under their seats in armored carriers to absorb potential blasts. Every modification was born from blood, every trick learned because someone else hadn't. Still, it was never enough. A trap could be invisible even to the most careful eyes, and no training could prepare a man for the moment he heard that soft metallic click beneath his heel. One sergeant described it best. It wasn't about being brave. It was about being smart enough to fear everything and still keep moving. By 1969, survival in the jungle wasn't about firepower. It was about discipline, about attention to the tiniest detail, about knowing that behind every branch, every shadow, every patch of dirt, there might be something waiting not to kill, but to tear, burn, blind, cripple. And yet, they walked, every day, step by careful step. Because in Vietnam, you didn't survive because you were fast. You survived because you were slow, scared, and smarter than the last guy who wasn't. Combat engineers and tunnel rats versus the invisible war. They were always the first in, and often the last to leave. Combat engineers, tunnel rats, men with no illusions about glory. Men whose job was not to fight the enemy directly, but to outthink him, to dismantle death, one wire at a time. To most soldiers, a trail through the jungle was a gamble. To the engineers, it was a puzzle. Every footprint, every twig, every unnatural shape in the soil was a potential clue. They didn't carry extra ammo. They carried probes, wire cutters, and sandbags. Sometimes even just sticks. They walked slower than anyone, crouched lower, stared longer, and when they stopped moving, everyone else held their breath. The tools were crude. A bayonet was used to prod the dirt. A mirror on a stick helped peek beneath logs. Some carried improvised mine detectors, though in the thick jungle they were often useless. Metal was buried too deep or masked by scrap. Many mines were built with wood or plastic precisely to avoid detection, so they relied on instinct, training, repetition, and nerves of steel. One engineer in Quang Tri carried a tiny notebook in his chest pocket. Every trap he encountered, drawn by hand, cataloged like a collector. He'd seen over 50 types by the time he rotated home. He was 21. Disarming a trap wasn't quick. Sometimes it took half an hour just to trace a single tripwire to its source. And that was assuming no one else stepped on anything while you worked. In certain cases, the engineers didn't even try to disarm the device. They detonated it on site, using controlled charges or makeshift line pulls. One loud boom now was better than 10 screams later. But if the surface was dangerous, the tunnels were hell. Tunnel rats were a different breed. Volunteers, usually small men, skinny and fast. They dropped into holes no wider than their shoulders, armed with a flashlight, a pistol, and a prayer. Inside, it was pitch black, hotter than the jungle above, tighter than a coffin. The air reeked of mold, oil, sweat, and fear. And every inch might contain a wire, a trap, a false wall. Some tunnels had floors rigged to collapse into spike pits. Others had crossbars with grenades tied above, ready to fall if disturbed. And worst of all, sometimes the tunnel wasn't empty. Tunnel rats fought in darkness, often within arm's reach of the enemy. No backup, no way out but the way they came in. Every breath felt like it could trigger something. Every noise, rat, drip, creak, might be the last thing they heard before steel or fire answered back. But they kept going, because every tunnel they cleared was one less safe house, one less arms cache, one less spider's nest of booby traps waiting for the next patrol. Tunnel warfare was never part of the original plan for U.S. forces. But by 1968, it had become essential. The Viet Cong's underground networks were vast hundreds of miles of connecting passages across Cu Chi, Tay Ninh, even under Saigon itself. These weren't just hiding places. They were trap factories, bomb labs, hospitals, bunkers, and every entrance, every wall, every air hole was guarded by death. Some rats rigged their own counter traps, tripwire triggers with smoke charges, squeeze grenades. They learned the enemy's tricks, then used them in reverse. It was a war of inches, shadows, and split-second reflexes. Not all came back up, and those who did were never quite the same. Eyes always scanning, hands always checking the ground, sleep filled with muffled clicks and falling bamboo. They didn't wear medals, didn't write books. Most didn't even tell their families what they did. But every patrol that walked through Cu Chi without losing a man, every fire base supplied by a road that hadn't blown up that week, owed something to the trap finders. In a war defined by ambushes and uncertainty, these men walked into death not by accident but by profession. They weren't just engineers. They were the ones who stared into the jungle's mouth and made sure it blinked first. What the traps left behind, some wounds never healed. Long after the booby traps were dismantled, after the war ended and the jungle quieted, the men who survived carried pieces of it home. In shrapnel, in missing limbs, in nightmares that came in the silence before sleep when the leaves rustled, the dirt shifted, and the mind returned to the one sound they could never forget: click. By the Pentagon's own records, over 10% of American casualties in Vietnam came not from bullets or rockets, but from traps, mines, spikes, wires, things that didn't wear uniforms or carry rifles, things that waited in the ground, patient and silent. A single step could end a man's war. For some, it ended everything. There were men who came back with no legs, their bodies shredded by anti-personnel mines buried inches beneath a jungle trail. Some lost eyes to trap-triggered grenades hanging from tree branches. Others came home with arms blown off at the elbow, their last memory being the act of brushing aside a vine that wasn't a vine at all. But the damage went deeper than flesh. Survivors often found themselves haunted not by battles, but by seconds. The moment before the trap triggered, the glimpse of something unnatural in the dirt. The split second when they realized a friend had stepped wrong, and there was no time to warn him. The sound of screaming that followed. One former Marine, wounded by a punji stake laced with human feces, said the injury didn't terrify him. It was the smell, the infection that followed, the sense of being rotted from the inside out, the fever that nearly killed him, and the knowledge that it was planned that way not to kill him quickly, but to punish him for weeks. Some couldn't walk in forests again. Others refused to step off paved paths. One veteran who lost his leg in Quang Nam still tapped the floor with a cane before entering a new room decades later in his own home. For many, The real injury was trust. The ground had betrayed them. The trees had lied. The air had hidden things. After Vietnam, the world felt full of things that might explode without warning. Relationships crumbled. Tempers flared. The war didn't end, it just got quieter. Families noticed. Some veterans flinched at the sound of metal clinking. Others refused to garden or dig in the yard. Fireworks brought rage, not celebration. And when asked, they rarely explained. How do you tell someone your best friend died because he stepped on a twig tied to a paint can full of ball bearings? How do you explain that you still hear the trigger mechanism every time the house creaks or a stick snaps underfoot? For those who died, there were no last words. Often, there was barely a body. A pressure plate didn't give warning. It took legs, then silence. Many were zipped up before anyone could recognize them. And for the ones who lived, the guilt lingered. Why him, not me? Why didn't I see it? Why didn't I check the trail more carefully? Those questions outlasted the war. In hospitals from Da Nang to Denver, prosthetic limbs became the silent trophies of Vietnam's trap war. Not from firefights, not from ambushes, from the dirt, from the leaves, from the moment no one saw coming. And yet, they endured. Some veterans returned to visit the sites years later. They found the jungle grown over, the trails gone, but the memory was exact. They could still point to the bush where it happened, the log that wasn't just a log, the place where they stopped being who they were before. In that sense, the traps did their job. They didn't just break bodies. They rewired minds. They carved scars into men who would never wear them on their faces but carried them all the same. The Viet Cong may have built the devices, but the ones who truly kept them alive were the men who stepped away with one leg, two lungs, and a memory that never let go. Lessons in fear, simplicity, and ingenuity. There were no generals behind the traps, no medals awarded, no statues carved. Most of the men who built them wore sandals made from tires and shirts stitched by hand. They had no tanks, no jets, no satellites, but they had time. They had jungle, and they had an understanding more powerful than any battlefield doctrine, that fear could stop an army faster than firepower. 50 years later, military textbooks still study the Vietnam booby trap campaign not for its brutality, but for its brilliance. How simplicity outwitted complexity. How the cheapest weapons could neutralize the most expensive machines. How one sharpened bamboo stake could halt a multi-million-dollar operation. It wasn't just about killing. That was never the real goal. The traps weren't there to win a conventional war. They were there to wear down the will, to grind away morale, to replace confidence with hesitation, to make every footstep a question mark. In that, they succeeded. Every trap trail became a battlefield. Every tunnel was a potential grave. Every tree branch could hide a wire. The psychological toll was impossible to quantify, but easy to see in the pacing of patrols, the caution of commanders, and the haunted eyes of those who'd seen too much dirt shift the wrong way. But this legacy doesn't belong only to Vietnam. Today, militaries around the world teach engineers, special forces, and EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, teams about the Vietnam trap war. Not because it can be copied, but because it can be understood. Because war is not just a matter of weapons, but of terrain, imagination, and pressure. Modern insurgents from Iraq to Afghanistan have adapted many of the same principles. IEDs in doorways, pressure plates in dusty roads, tripwires hidden in laundry lines. The ghosts of Vietnam walk in new wars, disguised in different sand, but built from the same blueprint. A trap doesn't need to be complex. It just needs to make someone hesitate. And when hesitation spreads, it becomes delay, then fear, then paralysis. That's what Vietnam taught us. A war doesn't have to be won by overwhelming force. Sometimes it can be lost one footstep at a time. But the legacy isn't only military. Among veterans, the memory of the trap war became a second war, one fought long after discharge, long after the boots came off. It lived in the amputations, the prosthetics, the shrapnel still lodged in bone. It lived in the fear of forests, the avoidance of trails, the nightmares triggered by fireworks or falling branches. Yet amid that darkness, something else endured: respect. Even many American veterans, bitter and broken as they were, admitted a reluctant admiration for the enemy's ingenuity. They weren't fighting barbarians. They were fighting craftsmen, architects of fear, engineers of survival. They made hell with sticks, one Marine said, and they made us walk through it anyway. Today, some of the old traps are preserved in Vietnamese war museums. Rusted stakes, pressure mines, trigger wires. School children walk past them, curious but unafraid. Tourists lean in for photos, unaware of what it meant to see one in place. But the real memorials aren't behind glass. They're in the men who survived. The ones who stepped lightly for the rest of their lives. The ones who couldn't stop scanning the ground, even on sidewalks. The ones who never forgot that the most dangerous enemy was the one you couldn't see. Because the legacy of the trap war wasn't just in death. It was in reminding us brutally, ingeniously, relentlessly, that in war, fear isn't just a side effect. Sometimes, it is the weapon